All right. Hi everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. We're celebrating Bat Month and Bat Week by turning fear into facts. So we're joined today by Dr. Gerald Carter, who will be telling us all about the social lives of vampire bats. As we get things going, we'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so let us know in the chat. One of our current projects at BCI focuses on educating people about bats in Brazil. Across the country, myths about vampire bats fuel fear, and fear kills bats. Too often, entire colonies are destroyed, vampire or otherwise, threatening more than 180 species that pollinate crops, spread seeds, and protect farms from pests. But you can help us change hearts and minds by visiting our website, backon.org, and donating to our campaign to turn fear into facts. So, as I said, our expert today is Dr. Gerald Carter. Gerald is an associate professor at Princeton University in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. He has studied bats for over 20 years with research focused on behavioral ecology and the social relationships of bats. After the presentation, Gerald will have time to answer your questions, so type those into the Q&A box if you're on Zoom, or type them in the comments if you're watching on another platform. So, hi, Gerald. What should we know about vampire bats and their social lives?
Okay, thanks for that introduction. I'll get started. Before I tell you about the social lives of vampire bats, I actually wanted to start by just thanking Bat Conservation International for hosting me. Bat Conservation International is the international organization focused on the conservation of bat populations and preventing extinctions of endangered bat species around the world. And I want to thank BCI for inviting me to give this talk and for everything else that you all do. Your work becomes more important every year. And as I've come to know this organization over the last few years as a member of the board, I've been extremely impressed with what BCI is doing around the world to save bat populations. And this is my favorite one sentence description of BCI from their website that we are a fiercely passionate expert conservationists and scientists who are leading the charge to ensure the worldwide survival of bats. Part of BCI's mission is public outreach and education, and that's something that they've been incredibly successful at since they started in 1982. Whenever I give a public talk on bats, I'm always amazed at how many kids in the audience love bats and know everything about bats in the same way that kids used to really be into, dinosaurs and trucks. I mean, bats are up there with dinosaurs now. And this is really something that is because of Bat Conservation International. And I want to start by saying that I was one of those kids that grew up with Bat Conservation International as an organization. I was a member of this organization. I got Bats magazine when I was a kid, all the way through high school. And my scientific journey that I'm going to tell you about, the things that we've learned about vampire bats, all start with an article in Bats magazine that I read when I was a high school student. The article was called The Lore of the Vampire, and it was about the research of a PhD student named Claudia Cohen at Cornell University. And because of this article, I read about her research and I contacted her and then I met her and I ended up going to Cornell University. And she's the one who introduced me to vampire bats. And everything I'm going to be telling you about was based on this this article that I read in Bats magazine. So let me introduce you to vampire bats. There are 1,500 species of bats, and three of them drink blood, and that's the common vampire bat, the white-winged vampire bat, and the hairy-legged vampire bat. They all live in Mexico, Central America, and South America. They have very similar ranges. This plot you see here, this is places where people have seen the common vampire bat, which is much more common than the other two species. They all have these distinct personalities, I would say. There are these differences in their behavior that correspond to how they feed. And I would describe the common vampire bat as kind of a neurotic little ninja because they're really jumpy, literally. They're really good at moving on the ground. And there have been entire books written on this topic of how vampire bats are amazing at jumping and moving around on the ground. They scamper, they run, they jump into flight. My lab has a captive colony of vampire bats, and we actually have little wheels that they run in. So their behavior is very unbat-like, very not similar to a lot of other bats that are often not so agile on the ground. And why are they like this? Well, it's because common vampire bats, they feed on the blood of much larger animals and they usually creep up to them on the ground. So here you see a vampire bat. It's making a bite and licking the wound near the hoof of a larger animal, a horse or a donkey. And they can feed on just about anything. So we usually observe vampire bats feeding on livestock, but here's a photo of bats feeding on penguins off the coast of Peru. Here's a vampire bat on the back of a puma or a mountain lion captured on a camera trap. Vampire bats can feed on snakes, crocodiles, turtles, falcons, deer, porcupine, armadillo. Even a squirrel has been fed on by a vampire bat. Um, so they're quite agile because they're able to adapt the way that they creep up to animals, but they usually creep up on the ground. And this exposes common vampire bats to a lot of different predators on the ground. And there are these really kind of weird and crazy experiments that have been done, I think in the 1970s, 1980s. I'm not sure you could even do these kinds of experiments today, but where they took vampire bats and basically threw them in a cage with other wildlife to sort of see how if the vampire bat could feed on them. And this is footage of those experiments where Desmodus, which is the common vampire bat, is trapped in a small cage with a rat snake. And instead of the snake just eating the bat, you can see here it says Desmodus follows through on the after strike of a rat snake. So the vampire bat was able to actually get away from the snake, and then the vampire bat actually fed on the snake. So this is amazing. And vampire bats are, in my opinion, sort of like super bats. They're capable of doing all of these things that other bats could only dream of. They have this special low frequency hearing, which is very unusual for their size. This weird sort of piggy face that they have, this is because they have a heat sensor in addition to the nose leaf that they have, which a lot of bats have a nose leaf that they echolocate through. They have biosonar they send out through their nose leaf. But vampire bats also have thermal perceptions. They can detect heat 15 centimeters away, and this allows them to find blood vessels close to the surface of the skin. And then they have these razor sharp incisors as well. And this is a common vampire bat. I'll talk a little bit about the other two species, the white-winged vampire bat, which can feed on many different animals, but really prefers birds. And white-winged vampire bats are not as jumpy and neurotic as the common vampire bat. They're sort of calm, and they usually climb along the underside of a branch very slowly and stealthily to feed on the feet of chickens or other birds. And the same thing happens with the hairy-legged vampire bat. This is also a bat that really prefers bird blood. And I think this is the bat that wins the award for cutest vampire bat because they have these really large eyes and really fluffy fur. And what's interesting is that when they feed on birds, they will often crawl onto the bird and attach to the bird like a giant tick. And this they often feed from the cloaca, they air the skin around the cloaca of a chicken. And so these three vampire bats, you can sort of think of the way that they prey on these larger animals being different. You can think about the way that they would approach a chicken, right? So a common vampire bat is going to prefer a chicken on the ground. And if the chicken's in the tree, it's going to walk along the top of the branch. The white-winged vampire bat is going to hide underneath the branch and very carefully go up to the toes and bite the toes. And a hairy-legged vampire bat is going to hide in the feathers of the chicken. And you can't even really see it well in this photo, but there it is, tucked under the tail feathers of this chicken. Okay, so different ways of approaching their prey, and they're specialized for on different kinds of on feeding on blood of different kinds of wildlife. Now, feeding on blood has shaped every aspect of vampire bat biology, including their social behavior, as I'll tell you about. And vampire bats have to feed basically every night, and getting blood from an animal that's much larger than yourself is a really tricky thing to do. And so everything I'm going to tell you about this point going forward is all about work that's been done on the common vampire bat. But a lot of the behavior is similar to the other two species. We know that common vampire bats often fail on their hunts. Young bats are failing almost every 3 nights. The older bats might fail once every couple of weeks, and they starve to death very quickly. So if they fail to get a meal for 3 nights in a row, they'll die, or their offspring can die. But um, they can come back to the roost if they haven't forage successfully, and they can receive a potentially life-saving donation of food from another bat in their group. They have this social safety net. They get these food donations from group members, but not from any group members, only the group members that they're socially bonded with. And this can be another bat that they're related to that's in their matriline, like a mother or a grandmother or a daughter or even a granddaughter or a sister or half sister. But it can also be other unrelated individuals. And this is what's really interesting about vampire bats is they have this helping behavior, this sort of altruistic food donation that's given to other individuals outside of their immediate family. They have to build these relationships up over time. And so I have spent about 15 years studying the social bonds of these bats and the helping behaviors that go along with these social relationships. I started my own research lab in 2018, and now my whole research group is basically studying the social lives of vampire bats. And you might wonder, why is anyone paying us to do this? Why do people care so much about the social bonds of vampire bats? And what I would say is that it's quite obvious that we care about the social bonds of people, right? So all of the social sciences are essentially trying to understand human life, which you may have noticed is a very complicated topic. But I think it's obvious to everyone that social relationships, the quantity and the quality of your social relationships is really important. It's very fundamental to human well-being and human health. And one thing that we don't think about much of the time is all of the biology that goes into this. It's not actually that well understood how individuals come to form relationships and what are the different strategies that we use to do that and what are the differences that make some people better at doing this and other people not. And this is these social bonds are fundamental to our health and they're something that everyone cares about. It's what most people care about most of the time. And it's very bad to have poor relationships or to not have any social relationships and to be lonely all the time. This is correlated with pretty much every bad health outcome you can imagine. All the things listed here, depression, anxiety, stress and inflammation, increased infection, the list goes on and on. And one of the things we've discovered in my field is that other mammals that live in groups also need these relationships. They also need social connection and stable social relationships. And all of these different lineages of mammals, all these different species of mammals, is a predictor of health and survival and offspring survival and reproductive success. And the other thing that we've come to learn, oh, and I should say that um, the way that we assess these social relationships, since we can't ask animals how many friends they have and how lonely they are, is we do what's called social network analysis, where we look at the interactions and associations of the animals and try to make a map of that to understand who has many interactions or who has many relationships and who doesn't. The other thing that's interesting is that the biological mechanisms that underlie social bonding are very what we call conserved across mammals, meaning that all mammals share the same, for instance, chemicals like oxytocin and vasopressin, which are hormones in the body and neuropeptides in the brain. And there are special receptors in the brain where you can look at, for instance, monogamous voles and non-monogamous voles, and you can see this difference in these receptors in the brain, which predict whether they will form bonds or not. And this is very well understood, the fact that these bonds have a, uh, they have a relationship to the ability of animals to form relationships with others. And mutations in this gene for this receptor, they predict human empathy, social anxiety, social attachment, disorders like autism, right? And so the same hormones that are involved with bonding with a newborn infant, like oxytocin, are also involved in bonding with your partner or even your dog. And so these are very basic biological mechanisms that underlie these relationships. And across all of these mammals, we've come to understand that relationships can influence individual health. And we're trying to understand this, but we're also trying to understand how animals build and regulate relationships with each other. How do individuals become socially successful? How do they come to form many relationships? And to understand this, what we want to do is experiments on social bonding where we can sort of manipulate interactions between animals. And this is something that's difficult to do with completely wild animals, especially the kinds of animals that are socially complex, like dolphins and elephants and and other primates. Now, vampire bats, as I'm going to show you, are very socially complex. I think they are very similar to dolphins and elephants and primates because they have these individualized relationships that are highly cooperative. But unlike those animals, they're so small that they spend almost all of their time in these really small, tight spaces that we can create in the lab. And all we know that all the social dramas of their lives play out in these spaces, and we can bring the bats in captivity, and they will do the same kinds of behaviors. And so we can closely monitor and measure their relationships with each other. We can experimentally manipulate helping rapes and social relationships. So here, for instance, with these bats in our lab, we can take a bat away overnight as if it had failed to feed and put it back, and we can see which individuals in the colony share food with it. And this is what this looks like. This is all filmed under infrared light. That's why there's no color in the video. And you can see that a bat might receive several offers of food. So this is a hungry bat that is being groomed by other bats. And this is a cue. When they groom around the mouth like that, it is a signal to the other bat that I'm willing to regurgitate food to you. And what happens is that the donor will open her mouth and the other bat will lick the blood that's been regurgitated. And this is a behavior that all mother bats do for their offspring, but they also do this for unrelated individuals, as I said. We can measure the donation from one bat to another, both through the amount of time that this behavior goes on and through the weight that the bat gains. We could also do all kinds of interesting experiments where we, for instance, make it more difficult for one bat to feed each other. There's a bat trapped in a little cage on the ground, and you can see the other bat comes down to the ground to feed that bat through these cage bars. And so we can do things like put a little bit of light there to make it a little risky. And we see that non-kin, unrelated individuals will still feed bats um, if they have a relationship with them under these conditions. We can look at these relationships over spans of time. So this is a food donation network between bats over a period of 4 years. And each of these bats shown here as these little nodes, you can see the food sharing relationships the bats have with each other. And the thicker this arrow is, the more the bat is being fed, given the opportunity that that bat had to feed the other bat. The red nodes are the females and the blue nodes are the males. And you can see that food sharing is mostly a female to female behavior. And the size of the node is how many recipients that bat is feeding. And what we've basically found is that these networks of food sharing are very kin biased. So the bats are they're very biased towards feeding their relatives, but they don't only feed their relatives. And what's an even better predictor of how much bat A feeds bat B is how much bat B has fed bat A. So these are very reciprocal relationships. And each bat kind of has its own food sharing network it's not random among the group. Each bat sort of has its own little network of friends. And the better way to look at one of these networks is to take a bat and say, who does this bat feed? And do those individuals feed this bat? And so if you take a typical female vampire bat and you look at her food sharing network, it'll look something like this. So she will feed her sons and her daughters until they reach reproductive age. When sons reach reproductive age, they get pushed out of the colony by whoever is the sort of dominant male that's there. He will push out all the other reproductive males. So sons disperse from where they're born, but mothers and daughters form these lifelong relationships, or potentially lifelong relationships, as far as we know. Daughters start feeding their mothers even when they're as young as 4 months, meaning that they're still taking milk from their mother. But if their mother hasn't fed on blood and they can feed on blood, they will regurgitate that blood back to their mother. Daughters are feeding mothers. Other related individuals are feeding each other, and then non-kin are also feeding each other in this reciprocal fashion. And then if you put a bat into this group, it might start receiving donations from another bat. And we might ask the question, well, what's the purpose of these non-kin relationships? Why do they exist? Why don't the bats just give food back and forth with their mother? Why isn't it that I feed my mother and my mother feeds me and that's all that we need? And what we found is that having these non-kin relationships allows bats to have a wider food sharing network, which which allows them to cope with the loss of an individual in their colony. So if we take away the mother or the daughter temporarily, the bats that have fostered these non-kin relationships, they cope better with that situation than a bat that has never created relationships outside of its family. We also find that some of these mechanisms we've talked about, like the oxytocin and vasopressin receptors in the brain, that predicts how much a particular bat tries to form new relationships outside of its family. The more of those receptors they have in certain brain regions, the more relationships they form, and the more non-kin relationships they form, the better they are able to cope with the removal of one of their food donors because they have more relationships. And so we find evidence also for this trade-off between quantity and quality of relationships. And we think that the vampire bats are trying to manage their relationships by having the optimal amount of the number and the investment that they make in each one. And this is a lot of what we're studying right now, is to try to understand the extent to which bats actually make, to which they sort of invest in their relationships in a way that makes sense for them, given their ecology. There's a lot of ways that we can track relationships. We can track relationships by how the bats move around and who's near who. There's a lot of mixing that goes on. When the bats are in the wild, they're often switching between different trees, for instance, or they might be in a cave and moving around within the cave, and they form these little temporary clusters and allows them to kind of mix around and interact and groom other individuals. Social grooming is really important in vampire bats. They spend about 5% of their time when they're awake grooming each other. So this is a bat grooming itself. And when a bat is grooming itself, it's way more likely to be groomed by another individual. And if we put things on their fur, or you can see these little bands that we put on their wings to identify them, the other bats try to remove those and they'll clean their fur. If we, for instance, wet their fur, the bats will receive grooming. So we really think grooming is a kind of low-cost helping. They also groom each other on the parts of the body where the bat has trouble grooming itself. So I think of social grooming as sort of a signal and also a kind of low-cost helping, one low-cost way to show an investment in another individual. And they also communicate a number of ways. So we know that, they're recognizing each other through sound. They're spending almost all of their time in complete darkness. This is a bat pup that's making what's called an isolation call. And every time a bat pup is separated from her mother, she makes these calls, allows the mother to come over and join her. And what you'll see here in this video, this is in a cave, is that the mother comes over. We assume that's the mother, but there's also another female that comes over too, right here. And we don't know who that is for this particular video, but we know that pups can receive grooming and care actually from different females. But again, it's not just anyone in the group. It's only very particular relationships that have to form over time. The bats also make contact calls when they're adults. And when vampire bats form relationships, they call more to each other, and their calls actually become more similar over time when they form a relationship. Okay, so what I want to do now is just sort of show you how we study relationships in our lab by just taking an example of one particular bat and one particular relationship. And so I'm going to show you how we track these relationships and how we study how they form. And this is a story about a bat named BD. And so BD is a bat that was caught flying out of this hollow tree here, which has over 200 vampire bats inside of it. This is a big tree in Panama. You can see that we have a little lawn chair set up here because we stay up all night to catch the bats coming out of this tree. And we captured BD and then put her in a social experiment, which went on for 14 months. So she and 18 other vampire bats from this roost, we brought to our field station in Panama, the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, and they were in a captive group where we marked them all, and then we introduced these bats to a bunch of other vampire bats that they had never met before. So this bat BD met 19 strangers that she had never encountered before. And then we watched how she interacted with these strangers. And the first thing we see is that she eventually clustered for warmth with these other bats. And clustering for warmth is something that any two bats can benefit from, because vampire bats, even though they're tropical and they live in warm environments, they start clustering for warmth when it gets below 24 degrees Celsius. Like you see here, this is like the probability that two bats are in a cluster, and you can see that it goes up when it gets colder, when it's below about 75 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is one of the ways that we think they start forming relationships. And then of those bats that she was clustering with, she started grooming a subset of them, most of them, 13 out of the 19 bats. And then of that subset of bats that she groomed with, she started sharing food with only two of them. Um, two of those individuals shared food with her, and this took 7 months to happen. And so, generally, what we see with relationship formation in vampire bats is that starts with this low cost grooming, and then starts with this clustering and then grooming. And we think that they use grooming to kind of test the waters because they can groom another individual and see how that individual responds to them. And if that individual responds positively, for instance, by grooming back, then they might escalate that grooming over time. Whereas if that doesn't go well, then the relationship doesn't really get going. And so what we find is that the social grooming that builds up leads into food sharing. And it's a way of sort of raising the stakes where the bats can first build up these allo-grooming relationships where they can see if it's reciprocated in real time before they make these higher investments in regurgitating a portion of their blood meal to feed the other bat when it's in need. So we studied how these relationships formed in this bat. We then released her back into the tree um, where we caught her from, and you can see that there's some like, little wires going to that tree, and you might have noticed that there was something glued onto her back. That's because we glued these little proximity sensors on her, which allow which sense each other. The distance from all the proximity sensors is logged. It's basically a tiny little computer, and what this allows us to do is track the interactions of the bats without going in there and disturbing them. So we can see which bats are hanging out with who. And this allows us to basically see whether the relationships that we studied in the lab extended out into the wild, and they did. So the bats that were living together, we also put these sensors on a number of bats that were in that tree. But were not included in our study. And so the bats that were living together for over a year in the lab, they were staying together and preferentially associating even when they're in the wild. And they were doing this in the roost. So this is a social network of who's near who in the roost. And when they're out foraging. Now they never left the roost together. All the bats left individually. But for instance, BD, when she flew out to feed, she would end up encountering other bats and spend more time with the bats that she's also grooming inside the roost. And so this is a whole side of their social behavior that's much harder to study, but we're seeing that there might even be cooperation out on the cattle pasture, for instance, where two bats might share a wound, but we also see that bats also fight over wounds, and there might be some interesting dynamics of bats trying to monopolize a wound or push away another bat. You can see these little fights that break out over the wound that one bat has made, because once a bat makes a wound, other bats can steal it from that bat. So anyhow, this BD is now in this tree, and she's been there for 2 years. And we came back 2 years later. We recaptured BD again. We brought her back to the lab, and now we have this profile of what she is like as a bat, what her social behavior is like. And we did more introductions with her. And this time we seeded the introductions, meaning that we 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 uh, we sort of housed her with particular individuals and then looked to see if those relationships, which we sort of had them live together for a week, and then we looked at whether that week together would spark a relationship, a grooming relationship that lasted for months. And in fact, that is what happens. It's sort of like college where you're living with a particular individual for a little bit, and then after you're no longer living with them, you still maintain contact with them. And that's what we see with these bats. But we don't understand exactly why two female vampire bats might form a really strong relationship. We can't always predict that. In this case, Lilith, BD met this one bat that my graduate student Imran named Lilith. And so this is now a colony that my first graduate student, Imran Razik, was studying and describing these interactions actually in way better detail than I had done, because he had surveillance cameras all going all the time, and so he just sampled their behaviors like 6 hours a day. He's basically becoming the Jane Goodall of vampire bats, just watching how all these vampire bats are interacting with each other. And what you see here is the social grooming rates from BD to Lilith and from Lilith back to BD. And what you see is that they're escalating over time. This is a period of about 2 months. And the relationship that formed between these bats was stronger than we saw from any other bat. So no other bat was grooming Lilith as much as BD. And I just want to remind you that these bats did not know each other before this experiment. They're not related to each other. They met in captivity. And then for whatever reason, they built up this very strong relationship. Um, and that relationship turned into a food sharing relationship where when we fasted Lilith, she was fed by BD. When we fasted BD, she was fed by Lilith. But then something very sad happened, which is that Lilith got sick with a gastrointestinal disease. So she had diarrhea and she passed away. And before she passed away, she had given birth to a pup. And you can see that as she got sick, there's this decline in maternal care, and she dies here at this. So she gave birth to a pup at this dash line, and she passed away at this dotted line. But what happened really surprised us. What happened was that BD took over the care of this pup, and she started lactating. She took over the care of this pup, and she gave this pup milk, and she gave this pup food, and she took care of that pup and adopted the orphan pup for the rest of the study. Um, and so it's just this interesting example. I mean, this adoption behavior is not very common. No other females took care of this pup, and it's not something that happens very often. A few researchers have seen it, but it's a rare behavior. We don't think it's a sort of normal adaptive behavior of vampire bats. We think it's a byproduct of the hormonal and neural mechanisms that underlie the other kinds of social bonds that they form. And I think it's a really interesting example of how this maternal care behavior gets co-opted for other individuals. In this case, this pup basically inherited the relationship that her mother had formed. And one thing that vampire bats have in common with humans, besides these individualized relationships that lead to things like well, not regurgitating the same with humans, but humans, many hunter-gatherer societies, there's a lot of reciprocal food sharing that goes on where I will share food with you when you're hungry, and you'll share food with me with you're hungry, and we're sort of interdependent on each other. And vampire bats have this food sharing system, but vampire bats are also like humans. They have this very extended maternal care. They make really intense investments in their offspring. So vampire bat can live to be 30 years old, and they can have a pup essentially every year. And the typical gestation period for a small bat might be something like 2 months or 4 months. And vampire bats have a 7 month gestation period. At birth, the the pup is 15% of the mother's mass. Okay, so at 3 months, they're still being carried around. They're already about 25 grams, more than half of their mother's mass. Try to imagine that. It's like you're a 120-pound female, human female, carrying a baby that's 60 pounds. It's like the size of a 10-year-old. So the vampire bats, very good mothers. And we think a lot of these pro-social traits that they have that allow them to extend these food sharing relationships to related individuals that are adults, but also related individuals that are also adults that are unrelated to them, which allows them to then create a reciprocal food sharing relationship. We think this is all kind of co-opted from this extreme maternal care, and it's just a great example of how um, these basic biological mechanisms that create one form of cooperation in case uh, parental care, maternal care can be co-opted to provide other kinds of relationships, like the relationships you have between siblings, or the relationships that happen in a monogamous relationship with biparental care, or the relationships that form between friends, or the relationships that form even between us and our pets, like dogs. These are all different kinds of social bonds that form cooperative relationships that are mutually beneficial for both individuals. Um, so those are just some of the things that we're learning from vampire bats. I want to leave a lot of time for questions, so I'll just sort of wind it down here and say that some of the take-home messages of what we've learned is that helping in vampire bats, it increases the survival of their genetic lineages, their family. So it's helping copies of the genes that underlie that trait in the bodies of other bats, but it also fosters this long-term reciprocal help. So by helping other individuals, these bats are also kind of helping themselves in the long term, because the more of these relationships they have, the better they do. Vampire bats can build new relationships outside their family, and they do this, we think, by testing the waters, meaning that they start with small investments and then escalating those investments based on the quality of the relationship that they have. And again, like I said, friendships are, I think, just an example of a cooperative relationship that other species also form, and these relationships have benefits and they're evolutionarily beneficial, but they're based on some of the same basic biological mechanisms, um, regardless of the benefit they have for us. The basic bonding mechanisms in the brain and the body are very similar across different species. And I think it's a great example of how, just taking a deep dive into another species that doesn't seem very similar to us, we can learn a lot of basic biology that might shed light on our own relationships. Um, and yeah, I think I'll leave it there. I'll thank my funders, Princeton University, Howard Hughes Medical Institute, National Science Foundation, National Institute of Health. I also, National Geographic, Smithsonian, um, the Humboldt Foundation and Ohio State University. And I also just want to thank all of these people who who really did all the work that I showed you. I'm sort of taking the credit for all of it, but this is all work that's done in collaboration with a lot of different people at different institutions over big spans of time. And so I want to th thank all the people that have helped me in my pursuit to understand the social lives of vampire bats. And I want to end with this QR code, which will take you to Bat Conservation International, because I really hope that you consider supporting them. Vampire bats are probably the only bat species that benefits from humans because they feed on livestock. Pretty much, as far as I know, pretty much every other bat species um, is not is not doing well in the presence of all the ways of that humans are changing the earth. And so, yeah, I'll take. I have time, I think, to take questions. So I see, I see there's questions accumulating.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. That was a really great presentation. Like Gerald said, if you want to make a donation to support BCI's work about around supporting and helping and protecting bats in Brazil, you can scan the QR code, make a donation. And let's get to some questions. So let's see. Vanita asks, do vampire diets, vampire bats diets include anything other than blood? Do they like snack on a mosquito here and there, sip on a
They
flower?
they feed on milk when they're young, and they feed on blood when they're adults. You don't even have to give them water. They can survive without water. Some people have seen evidence of insects in in vampire bat feces, but I think that might just be things being ingested when they're grooming each other.
Steph,
I think they only feed on blood as adults.
got it. Steph asks, do hairy-legged vampire bats tend to have any more diseases transmitted to them if they're feeding near the cloaca?
I don't know the answer to that. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, we don't know much about the natural history of those bats or the biology of those bats, so I don't know.
That's okay. What are the other questions here? Um, Another friend asks, do you feed your bats live prey in the lab?
So, say that again. Do we allow them to feed on live animals? Is that the question?
Yes.
Yeah, we have done that. We did an experiment where we had these baby bats are born in captivity, and we wanted to release them to the wild, but we didn't know if they would even survive in the wild. So what we did was we put chickens in their cage and then filmed to see if they could figure out how to feed on a chicken. And they were clumsy, but they were able to do it. They could feed on animals, live animals, despite not ever having encountered a live chicken before. They were able to do that task. Um, but it did seem that they were, I mean, we didn't have a good control group because I haven't seen wild born vampire bats feed on a chicken at that age. but they were definitely clumsier than the adults were. But yeah, we do sometimes do that.
Oh, so just for clarification, then how do you feed the bats normally?
Oh, yeah. So usually what we do is we go to a slaughterhouse, a meat processing plant, and we get a big bucket of blood, like a 5 gallon bucket of blood, and bring it back. Or actually, where we get the blood now, it's actually given to us already defibrinated, which is the thing you have to get all the clot out of the blood. It's just given to us in gallon containers. And so that's quite nice because we can just pour it into little spouts and we give the bats little spouts of blood. It's sort of like things that are used to give water to birds.
Fascinating, like kind of like hummingbird feeders or like hamster
Yeah, I
water.
mean, you can give blood in like a hamster bottle feeder, but the blood tends to clot in that little tube. So we have a little dish it's like a little spout that sticks out. It's like I think it's called like a silo style water dispenser. Um, yeah.
Huh, fascinating. So we've got another question. Someone's asking, um, do do vampire bats pass diseases to the animals they feed from? And if so, um, could we be eating chickens that have been exposed to diseases passed to them from vampire bats?
Well, they feed on more than chickens. They feed on a number of things. They feed on cattle, and the big disease of concern is rabies because vampire bats are a reservoir for rabies, meaning that rabies can what's called spill over from vampire bats to livestock because vampire bats are going out and biting livestock all the time. And people throughout Latin America, it's been a concern because this rabies transmitted by vampire bats, essentially, it's a big burden on agricultural development because if you have rabies outbreak in your cattle, they can die. And um, it- the main way that rabies is attempted to be controlled in vampire bats is to just kill all the bats by putting basically kind of a rat poison mixed with Vaseline on their fur. It's called vampiricide. And they spread it on the bats, and the bats groom each other, and this poison gets passed to all the bats, and then the bats all die. And this is actually better than what people used to do before, which was to just go out and kill all bats they see everywhere, which is really bad because a lot of times they don't know what are vampire bats and what are not vampire bats, so people will burn trees or burn caves and just kill any bats that they see. So this vampire specific poison was actually a big step up from the perspective of bat conservation because it's only targeting vampire bats. However, when people actually studied the effectiveness of poisoning vampire bats to prevent rabies, what they found was that if anything, it's not correlated with a decrease in rabies outbreaks. If anything, it's correlated with an increase in rabies outbreaks. And this is a this is a big shock, but actually it's something we've seen before with bovine tuberculosis in badgers. There was a period where cows were getting this disease from badgers. And so the British government went out and just killed all the badgers. And then what they saw was that the rates of the disease went up. And the reason that this happens is because the vampire bats actually build up a titer against rabies. And this is what keeps levels of rabies low is that there's a kind of the bats are essentially if they don't get rabies, they're kind of protected from rabies, just like when you get vaccinated. And if you just go and kill all the vampire bats, what you actually do is you increase movement of bats on a larger scale. You've got all these bats moving they're moving more, and this actually allows bats to move into areas where they normally wouldn't move, especially the males. And this is what's actually causing rabies to move around on the landscape more. So this is an example of how, a better understanding of the ecology and the movement of vampire bats can lead to more effective management of disease. It's not so simple as just kill all the bats and then the disease will go away. If, in this case, that seems to have backfired in that it didn't really work. All of this management of vampire bats where we're just trying to kill them all wasn't working. And so, a much better thing to do, vaccinate vaccinate the cattle against rabies, which protects the cattle. There's also efforts to vaccinate the vampire bats in various ways, either by making a vaccine that the bats can spread to each other, or there's even an attempt to make a self-transmitting vaccine so that the bats are actually um, transmit or essentially vaccinating each other through the colony, and you can get the whole population to be vaccinated. But I won't say more on that. But that's the main concern with vampire bats is rabies.
Got it. Wow. All right, so we've got a question from YouTube. Why do those two vampire bat species prefer bird blood? Is it because of access in a shared environment or some specific nutrients in the blood?
Yeah, actually, this is what that graduate student that I read about in Bats Magazine was studying. She wanted to know whether they're actually adapted to the blood of birds versus the blood of mammals, or if it's just the package that the blood comes in. And if they like to, like I told you, that they like to feed in different ways. But what if you just fed them on bird blood or mammal blood? And what she found is that those two species are in fact physiologically adapted to bird blood, meaning that if they get fed on if they fed on mammal blood for too long, then they start to get sick. So, yeah, they actually are adapted to bird blood, and also the anticoagulant in the saliva. So I don't even know if I mentioned this, but vampire bats have a anticoagulant which keeps the blood flowing when they make a bite, and that's also specialized for mammals in the common vampire bat, and for birds in the ones that specialize on birds.
Wow. Okay, a question from Instagram. Have these bats ever been observed having quote unquote friendships with other species of bats?
Um, we we haven't studied that in vampire bats. If anything, vampire bats might actually push other bats away. They might even be a problem for bat conservation, because what seems to happen is that they sort of move in and into a roost, and there's some evidence that the other bats, the other species of bats, will move away from them, and they can kind of take over a roost. And in places where there's a lot of agriculture, it might be that the vampire bats are actually pushing out some of these other bats that are fruit bats or insect-eating bats. I mean, that hasn't been studied in detail, but we've seen some evidence of that. But in general, bats, the 1,500 species of bats, there's a lot of associations that form between different species. You find different species in a cave together, and you can find different species associating, like even clustered sometimes in the same place. And there was a study done showing how uh, there are individualized like associations or preferred relationships that form also between species and not just within species. And there's also some studies done showing how bats can learn from other bats of other species. For instance, if they see that a bat is responding to a sound and they go and they eat an insect, another bat might observe that and then learn that that sound means food.
Oh, okay. Angela asks, aside from these three vampire bat species, do you know of other bat species that engage in this food donation behavior, or any other sort of social behavior like providing first aid? And she mentions a study that took place with mice.
Yeah. So, well, let me start by saying the regurgitated food sharing actually does happen in some other species. So, Glossophaga, which is a bat that feeds on insects, but also nectar, mothers regurgitate food to their offspring. Regurgitating food to offspring is actually not so uncommon, right? So there's a number of animals, even outside bats, where mothers regurgitate food to feed offspring. Um, in some of the carnivorous bats, there's a bat named Vampirum spectrum, which is it's like a 1 meter wingspan, a big bat that would eat other species of bats. And those bats, the parents can bring food back to feed their male and female together or raise young, like a lot of birds. And the parents can bring food items like a bird back and feed it to the kids. But also, I think they've seen adults feeding each other a male, for instance, giving food to a female or vice versa. I can't remember if it's been seen in both directions. But that's also examples of like food transfers that happen. There's also examples of other gleaning bats, a bat called Micronycterus that would like it flies and captures insects off of leaves and then bring those back and transfer those items. But you do see that primarily from parents to offspring, but that's also true of the vampire bats. It's almost all parents to offspring, and it's only because we've watched them so long that we actually know that there's all this stuff, other stuff happening. And so, a lot of people think that if you just go and just watch vampire bats, really, in like one day you'll see all these amazing things. But it's only because we've watched them for so long that we've seen all these behaviors, and similar behaviors might exist in other bat species that haven't been studied as much and haven't been watched for hundreds and hundreds of hours like we've watched vampire bats.
Okay. All right. So we got another question here from, let's see, where was it? From Instagram at Cap Rock Canyon State Park asks, they're saying park intern here at Cap Rock. What is it in their saliva that helps scientists for stroke patients?
Yeah, it's that anticoagulant. I think it's been I don't know if it's apparently from one of the last that I remember reading about it was that it's better than anything that people have been able to create, synthesize themselves in the lab in terms of being a like a blood thinner. And I think they called it Draculin, the like chemical that they were able to get from the vampire bat's saliva. But there were these studies. I remember there's even like a special contraption that people use to like uh, try to collect the saliva from vampire bats so it could be studied chemically. But I mean, this is just another example of how, all this biodiversity that we have, we don't know all. I mean, every species that's evolving is creating essentially technology and creating, genetic information that that has that might have uses, like for instance, biomedical uses that are yet to be discovered. And every time we lose species, we're throwing away all of that information that has accumulated for millions of years. And so we don't know all the ways that the things that we're losing might be valuable to us. And so this example of vampire bats producing something that just happens to be better medically than anything we were able to create for treating stroke is just one example of this general theme um, of not wanting to assume that unless we can like see the obvious use of some animal is like this animal you would think for instance that vampire bats don't have anything to contribute to humanity because they're essentially parasites, but um, all living things have all of this genetic information that's so valuable. I mean, obviously, it's not just that all living things are valuable because we can use them, right? So everything is also inherently valuable, and everything in nature has an inherent value that we need to come to recognize. Besides just, for instance, can we extract something from it for biomedical purposes? But that's a longer conversation.
Oh, okay. Question here from Madison. She asks, or she says, you mentioned that social animals can suffer mental deterioration if socially isolated. If a vampire bat was socially isolated but fed blood, would they face the same issue? What if they only had strong relationships, or vice versa, if they only had weak relationships? How would this differ from total social isolation?
Yeah, those are all things we're studying right now. So I wouldn't want to give a firm answer, but we're actually, that's one of the experiments we've been talking about. And I'm not even sure someone might have done it in my lab already, but I'm not thinking about it. But yeah, this question of like how much stress do they have when they're isolated, um, with blood, without blood, like how much of the stress that they experience would be due to being socially isolated versus isolated from food. And we're measuring, we're in the process of uh, where we're designing studies right now to measure stress and also whether stress is related to their social integration into the group. Also things like their immune function, right? Because social stress is related to your ability to mount an immune defense. You're more likely to get sick when you're stressed. Also, your aging, biological aging or epigenetic aging. might be correlated with social stress as well. We're looking at that because we have a what's called an epigenetic clock for bats where we can see whether they're biologically aging faster or slower than their actual age.
Mhm. Um, Question here. Do vampire bats have anything in their saliva that causes itchiness or irritation the way mosquitoes do after they bite?
I don't know. Um, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. But I mean, this I think one difference is that the mosquito is piercing into your skin, whereas what a bat is doing is taking a little divot of skin, and then it licks the blood that's kind of flowing out, and so its bite is designed to bleed a lot, but it's not necessarily injecting it into your body in the same way a mosquito would be. But I don't know the answer to
Okay. And you're not willing to do some personal research to
that.
find out?
It's hard to get that approved by the ethics committee.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Let's see. Ross and Lynn ask, do the ejected males form bachelor roosts? And if not, do they have a higher mortality rate?
Yeah, this is like one of the big questions, I think. Yeah, the male vampire bats do form bachelor groups. We just don't study them as much. Um, it does seem that if you have bachelor groups without females present, especially, the males will form these food sharing relationships. When the females are there, it's more rare to see food sharing between males, but there's food sharing from females to males, from males to females. When the males are together in the presence of females, they tend to just compete with each other over access to these females. Female vampire bats don't have a reproductive season. It's kind of just go. It's a reproductive season all the time for vampire bats. Um, but yeah, there's kind of some gaps in knowledge there surrounding the males and how they cope with the lack of of having these social relationships and whether they have much higher mortality or not.
Okay. Um, and then I guess we'll finish up with a few questions to kind of tie it all together. Um, oh, where was that question? How could someone become involved in this type of research or volunteer? Are there volunteer help? Do you need help? Do you need volunteers? We
It's,
one person, Steph,
I,
has said they volunteered to come be be experimented on with the bats to find out if it's itchy or not. But sorry, Steph, I don't know that they're accepting that kind of volunteer help. But yes, how can one get involved?
um, Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on it depends on just what's happening. I mean, in our lab, sometimes we're at a time and a place where we can use people's help, and so it's sort of like, does anyone want to, we'll be hiring people, and there's like waves that come and go, and other times we have to turn a lot of people away. We generally don't. In some the relationship with volunteering is difficult. We tend not to we tend to hire for positions rather than taking volunteers. But it doesn't hurt to just reach out. And I would say that if you're really interested if you know of a scientist doing research you're interested in, it's totally fine to just email them and ask. And a lot of times they might come back to you and you might have to be persistent. You might have to email them multiple times. There's probably people that have emailed me like 5 times. I haven't replied to any of their emails. And then if they're persistent enough, they might I might because there is often a lot of interest, but a lot of that interest is it can be quite superficial. Like somebody might be interested in being involved, but then they lose interest after a while. And so I think just being persistent is the key. Um, but yeah, I don't know what to say beyond that. But yeah, if you're feel free to email me. I'm sure you can find my email address if you just Google my name. And I can I might not reply quickly, but I'll usually reply. Yeah.
Yeah. And lastly, Is there any way people can follow the progress of your research or the lab? Do you have like an Instagram?
Oh yeah, socialbat.org is the my website. I used to update it more frequently than I do now. I've just, I've as my responsibilities have increased, I haven't I used to have sort of a blog where I would as things are happening. I would even like post my notes from the field, like when I'm out all night with the vampire bats. I would take notes and I would just put them there in the on my website. And you can go back in time and you can read those. But what you'll see over time is that I've stopped doing that. There's every once in a while, like every few months I'll post something, but I don't sort of live post everything that's happening in the lab like I used to.
Understandable. It gets busy, I'm sure. Well, thank you so much, Gerald, for shining a light on vampire bats and their social lives. If you listeners want to help us turn fear into facts, you can make a donation by scanning the QR code on the screen or visiting batcon.org. Any final words for us, Gerald?
Um, Yeah, I guess the last thing I'll say is that, I just want to reiterate the thing I said about that vampire bats have been so studied, and there are 1,500 species of bats, and we just know much less about those other species than we do about vampire bats. Um, people are willing to go. There's a lot of bird watchers. There's a lot of people who are willing to spend a lot of time watching baboons in Africa, and there's just far fewer people studying bats. And so I would say that bats are just this treasure trove of mystery where there's just so many interesting things about them that are yet to be discovered. And it's really sad that so many bat populations are in decline before we even, discover all of the amazing things about them. So, um, yeah, I would just say that if you're interested in bats, I recommend them as an animal to study because there's just so many things we don't know about them still.
Agreed. Well, thanks everyone, and we'll see you